All right, welcome. Welcome to this episode of Herman Bavinck's Generous Theology. I'm your host, Romans 918. It's great to have you here. Let's start off with our first slide. And this third session here is called Target Replacement, and we want to bring back the analysis that we had looked at earlier, that Bavinck had done. The analysis that he had that focused on the new secular science of psychology as it developed in the 19th century, and how these new psychologists in a secular fashion sought to replace traditional Judeo-Christian categories of thought with this new phenomenological psychology, this science of self, this secular humanism for the most part. In it, of course, was emphasized, in contrast to the old and traditional ways, the autonomy of self and the rejection of external authority. Further, another emphasis was the autonomy of rational speculation and the rejection of dogma. And so this manifested in considering that meaning was ultimately generated by the inner light of the person looking inside of themselves, rather than defining meaning around a fixed lawgiver who defined value and meaning in an external sense. Next slide. And so Bavinck did have some great insight to this developing process. And so the conflict arose between these new secular values and the traditional religious values. And so the secularists really needed an apologetic, or they needed a justification. They needed an answer to the question, why be secular in this new way when one could be religious? For the presupposition at that time in society was that religion, if not perfect, offered much that was noble and good, and much that was virtuous and idealistic. And even non-believers saw religion in that vein and spoke highly of a religion that they themselves did not necessarily partake in. And so the new psychologists offered a dialectic narrative, the story of progress. And in this story, there was a movement, there was a development, and characterized as childish and immature were the traditional categories, the religious mindset, the idea of serving the external lawgiver. To serve God with all one's heart was understood and characterized as an underdeveloped, childish, and immature perspective on reality. And this new Enlightenment psychology presented something better. That is, progress or movement towards a mature, a healthy, an empowered phenomenological mindset. In other words, look to your own self. So perhaps you've heard people say things like, to thine own self be true. Next slide. And so the controversy really arose here over what was the role that the individual human and that the person's mind played in generating meaning. Is meaning and value ultimately a product of the mind? And does the mind control or dominate nature in generating what is right and what ought to be and how to understand things? And so we can see that in the early romanticism of the age and the Jena school with the subjective idealism of Fichte and the philosophy of others, such as Kant and Schelling, we see that they embarked upon a course in which the human subjectivity controlled and defined the world around us, as opposed to instead being the mind playing a more passive role, where the world itself is what defines the human subject. That is to say, the human subject is an actor in a larger world. Now, Kant had a mature understanding when he noted that human subjectivity acted as a filter through which the events and stimulus of the outside world first needed to pass through, and that the world is conditioned by the lens of our perception and reason. And this is right and good, for we live in a universe that is larger than what we can see, measure, observe, or perceive about it. And our mind and our senses filters and removes so much of the stimulation that shapes our reality. And so that means, for example, our sense of hearing does not present to our conscious mind all of the audio interactions and stimulus and events that are going around us, but a subset of it that the mind deems to be most important. And so it is the same with our sense of a sight. We can, Kant and others acknowledged, only see some subset of the various wavelengths of light and electromagnetic energy. And from those subsets, our mind tries to put together a picture. Next slide. But is this situation that the psychologists set up really a controversy in which the Christians or the religious believers of the day took the other side? So, but for example, just which theologians were making the objection that we do not see the world through the lens of perception and reason? Who was giving that Sunday sermon? Of course, here's where the target replacement comes in. What the sermons were teaching was that human individuals are sinful before a holy God, and B, God has provided a way to reconcile and deal with that sinful condition. And so we see the Enlightenment Brights seeking to replace that mode of thinking. And so this idea of progress is meant to be a strategy to move away from the doctrinal content of Christianity or religion. And at times, it even seems as if the working phrase is anything but Christianity. And so we will see the Enlightenment Brights consider any sort of speculative approach, just so long as they're not considering the traditional Christian one. Next slide. And so you see that here with this example. We have a sign in the slide that said, "We believe Black Lives Matter. Women's rights are human rights. No human is illegal. Science is real. Love is love. Kindness is everything." And so this is an example of the sort of target replacement, out with the old, in with the new. Now, who could possibly object to these slogans as they're stated? Well, unfortunately, the objection comes in understanding that these statements represent coded language. And in fact, there is an accusation here. No reasonable person would object to the changes, except the changes are designed to reinforce secular values and to reject religious values. And so this sign is communicating a rigged game where the secular house always wins. A certain perspective is emphasized while another perspective is rejected. We even see in our schools today that in some cases parents are actually restricted from observing their children's education. This desire to mold young minds is so strong. And so the new sciences of psychology and psychiatry that started in Bavinck's day started a spiral in which religious thought was downgraded over time in a progression from being at first merely bad form to be religious to eventually religious thought being offensive or something offensive to state publicly, even if one held to a religious position in private. And finally, the dialectic cycle completes with the narrative that religion is a form of mental illness. And so what's objectionable about rejecting the phrase Black Lives Matter? Well, additional context would be required. If the phrase Black Lives Matter could be a slogan understood in a natural and wholesome way that is compatible with traditional Christianity, then there'd be nothing wrong or objectionable with the phrase. Of course, there is a concern, an unstated context, a content that is much different than the slogan implies. And so Black Lives Matter, as coded language for a particular socialistic outlook, is indeed very objectionable. Similarly, the same thing for the second phrase, women's rights are human rights. Well, who could object to that and be reasonable? And the answer is, well, it depends upon the context, doesn't it? Because the typical right here being advocated for is the right for abortion, and that is far controversial. And when opponents, people who reject the doctrine of abortion, disagree, they don't insist that they are denying a woman a fundamental human right. They instead emphasize that they are insisting that a human right be granted to the human in the womb who otherwise faces death. Similarly, the statement "no human is illegal" is hard to object to in a very neutral context, except that there is no neutral context implied here. What is, of course, meant is one form of immigration policy is to be preferred over another. And so perhaps it's not so neutral after all. Similarly, underneath that, science is real. Who could object to that? I know Christians in a traditional and normal, healthy context don't object to the saying, except that the phrase here is used to mean science is real while religion isn't. And so, of course, the objection becomes obvious. And the same thing for love is love. Well, that's a tautology, right? Who could find anything objectionable about that? Except that the slogan covers up that it's not just about love in the abstract, but it's about competing forms of moral behavior. And the traditional side has a different view of what that is than some of the new modern and postmodern thoughts. Kindness is everything. Well, surely we can all agree upon that. But again, content and context is king. So while kindness is an important virtue, in religious discussions and in ethical discussions, it is also important to consider the topic of justice. There are objective forms of right and wrong. And to do right is to be rewarded, and to do wrong is to be punished. And so maybe in that sense, it's misleading to say kindness is everything. But if any traditional religious person walks into this school and makes the statements above, as we've argued here, we will find the secular mindset reacting against it. And it will not, of course, be to debate the concepts. It will be instead to progress down this dialectic. It's bad form to state an objection to these. It's offensive to oppose any of these slogans in a public place. And finally, there is a form of mental illness if you disagree with the meaning behind these slogans. Next slide. And so we see this in an educator, Chester Pierce, who made this quote: "Every child in America entering school at the age of 5 is mentally ill because he comes to school with certain allegiances to our founding fathers, toward our elected officials, toward his parents, toward a belief in a supernatural being, and toward the sovereignty of this nation as a separate entity. It is up to you as teachers to make all of these sick children well by creating the international child of the future. Wow. Next slide. William Z. Foster said in his work, among the elementary measures the American Soviet government will adopt to further the Cultural Revolution are the following. The schools, colleges, and universities will be coordinated and grouped under the National Department of Education and its state and local branches. The studies will be revolutionized, being cleansed of religious, patriotic, and other features of the bourgeois ideology. The students will be taught on the basis of a Marxian dialectical materialism, an internationalism, and the general ethics of the new socialist society. Present obsolete methods of teaching will be superseded by a scientific pedagogy. This doesn't sound so harmless anymore, does it? It doesn't sound as if these educators simply want children to learn that kindness is important. It sounds instead like these educators want something far different. Next slide. Charles Potter wrote this: education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism, and every American school is a school of humanism. What can a theistic Sunday schools meeting for an hour once a week and teaching only a fraction of the children do to stem the tide of the 5-day program of humanistic teaching? Next slide. And so we see one more specialist says this: the schools cannot allow parents to influence the kind of values education their children receive in school. That is what is wrong with those who say there is a universal system of values. Our humanistic goals are incompatible with theirs. We must change their values. Wow. Those slogans don't seem so harmless anymore, do they? Science is real. It doesn't really appear to be an argument about the scientific method, does it? But rather a target replacement for a particular kind of secular worldview. The late Christian apologist Ravi Zacharias quoted a political activist that said, "Let me write the songs of a nation, and I don't care who writes its laws." Next slide. And so we can see a contemporary example of an Enlightenment valuation in this video made by the School of Life, titled "A Test to Work Out If You're a Good Person." And it is a beautiful example, a well-made video, and it's a beautiful example of the perspectival and relativistic ideals of the Enlightenment. And it is in a sharp contrast with the definition of goodness or being a good person as measured by a traditional Judeo-Christian method, where measurement against an objective law from an objective authoritative lawgiver is the primary means of measuring goodness. Here, in this enlightened consideration, being good is something that you yourself evaluate about yourself. No one else can decide your goodness. Only you can. And so the question that we have to press the modernist on is, who thought this was a good idea? Why should a person's goodness be self-examined? Is that what we do in our court system? Do we bring a defendant to trial, and does the judge open the session and say, "My dear defendant, we need you to look inside and decide your goodness in this matter"? Or does the judge instead measure the defendant's actions against an objective moral standard. Next slide. So, how did we get here? How did it turn? How did the Enlightenment go from the theistic visions of the early Enlightenment thinkers like Kant and Hegel? How did that develop to the later secular sensibilities of people like Strauss and Marx and Nietzsche? Next slide. We're so happy to have a chance to consult our Cambridge history of philosophy in the 19th century to examine this in some detail. And the answers are complicated and somewhat controversial. One must speak in general, crafted, measured generalities. And yet there are certain trends that lead to the great divorce between Judeo-Christian values and the modern, secular, phenomenological worldviews. Next slide. And so, as we've noted, early in the Enlightenment, we have this theistic idealism of Kant and Hegel. Also, others of this time would be Schelling, Schleiermacher, Fichte, and Kant and Hegel are very important and influential here. They were principal voices, but the orchestra of German idealism had many other contributors. Next slide. And so Kant himself, as perhaps the culmination or the most important voice in this early part of the Enlightenment, saw his thought as a systematic progression, as the pendulum of psychology swung between the extremes of dogmatism and skepticism, and finally settling or culminating or progressing or arriving in his philosophy of metaphysics, which provided the first scientific basis for modern philosophy. And so in Kant's view, history was a series of oscillating steps, alternating between the poles of rationalism and empiricism. And his own work was a middle or mediating ground that represented a harmonious synthesis of rationalism and empiricism. Next slide. In contrast with Kant, Hegel had ideas. In his history of philosophy, he detailed that science, the art of science, was itself the quintessential human activity. And in looking through history, he could see progress and development. And so going back to the Greeks, who spoke of a logical principle of being, and then following through to later thinkers who developed that early germ into a more complicated logical principle of becoming, and then finally culminating in his own theories, in his own era, and his own work building upon the philosophy of Descartes and Spinoza and Fichte, the subjective idea. Next slide. And Hegel articulated perhaps a variation on the Aristotelian arch of logic, at least a subjective idea of concluding universals from an aggregate of particulars. And he saw the history of philosophy as this triumphant and progressive march, using dialectical pivots or steps in which one would converge eventually toward definitive truth and science in philosophy. And so how had history given us Kant and Hegel and these conclusions that they reached? Well, perhaps it is best to summarize the early Enlightenment in terms of an important school, the Jena Romanticism. Jena was a university in Germany where these ideals developed. And one of the key romanticists of this period at Jena was the philosopher Schlegel. Now, while we talk about progress in the human condition, Schlegel thought perhaps slightly differently. He valued the best thinkers from antiquity. He thought the pre-Socratics and Plato and others had articulated mature and meaningful philosophical truth. Next slide. against the traditional values of the Judeo-Christian worldview of the West. Schlegel, in his early life, saw great value in the ancient forms of skepticism, and he argued and lectured at the university in Jena, where he offered that all truth was relative and agreed with Protagoras, man is the measure of all things, and that whatever individuals deem to be true is true. And a compelling quote here is, the importance of a radical form of skepticism even went as far as to call into question logical laws. And this radical skepticism was an essential starting point for any genuine philosophy. So the Jena wind-up, the Jena mix, is to start one's engines on the skeptical fuel of the pre-Socratics and go from there. Next slide. And so this comes back to our idea of the Enlightenment as a target replacement, getting rid of the old in favor of the new. Schlegel was representative of the Jena movement, which was largely an approach that was unwilling to accept Christian dogma, and instead offered that one must dogmatically start from an extreme skepticism, even willing to question the laws of logic in the quest to construct a philosophy. And so, insightfully, Calvinist philosopher of the last century, Gordon H. Clark, thought that the efforts of those like Schlegel, who even would reject the laws of logic in the construction of their system of philosophy, that this step was not an improvement, but was a descent into irrationalism. And so remember the ABCs of the secular Enlightenment: anything but Christianity. Next slide. All right. Thank you for listening. For Herman Bavinck's Generous Theology, this is Romans 9:18.